Hey everyone! Tonight we'll drift back through the shadowy corridors of Tudor England, where the rustle of silk skirts and the clang of steel still echo against the cold stones. You're not stepping into a fairy tale, you're standing right inside the Tower of London, where moss-covered walls are soaked with secrets, and the air is heavy with the memory of a queen who once smiled serenely as she walked toward the scaffold. The death of Anne Boleyn was not just a single stroke of a sword, it was a whole performance of fear, public humiliation, and the chilling thought that eyes might still see for a few final seconds. Don't worry, you definitely wouldn't survive going through that. So tonight we'll just stay seated, safe in the present. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And by the way, let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? For someone out there, it might already be midnight, the perfect hour to hear a dark Tudor tale. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lean back, take a slow breath, and let your imagination carry you to 16th century London. It's May, and the wind sweeps through the thick stone walls of the Tower of London, carrying a strange chill, even though the sun is still shining. You walk alongside Anne Boleyn on the stone path, the same one she proudly walked 3 years earlier as a newly crowned queen. Now, on that very same corridor, the eyes that once gazed with admiration now glimmer with curiosity and a hint of cruel delight. It feels like you're inside a long-running TV drama, but this time, the scriptwriter is none other than Henry VIII, one of the most famously wife-rich husbands in European history. If Netflix had existed back then, this series would have hit #1 trending in just a few days. You already know the history. On the 19th of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, was officially executed for charges of treason, adultery, and incest. The accusations sounded like a cheap novel, but they were staged with surprising professionalism. Henry even invited a swordsman from France to carry out the execution instead of using the blunt axe of English headsmen. People called it an act of mercy. But you and I both know it's more like being kicked out of a group chat with a fully edited slow-motion effect. Merciful, yes, but also politically calculated. One strange detail few people notice. During the 17 days she was imprisoned in the Tower of London, Anne remained calm. Sometimes even joking. She once said she'd be remembered as the headless Anne, as if turning a tragedy into a dark joke. Witnesses recalled that on the morning of her execution, Anne smiled, prayed, and chatted cheerfully with her ladies-in-waiting. Imagine knowing you're about to be permanently logged out of life, and still being calm enough to joke about it. That might be a skill modern office workers should learn too. When the deadline is breathing down your neck, you smirk and say, well, submitting late has become tradition anyway. But historians still debate that calmness. Was it inner strength, or simply a psychological defense mechanism known as dissociation? Perhaps, in her mind, everything had become blurry, as if she were merely a character in a play and others were the audience. And that's exactly what it was, because the entire execution was set up like a public performance. A stage, an audience, dialogue, and an ending already written. Imagine it. That morning, the sunlight was strangely bright. Church bells echoed across London, reminding everyone of the historic event about to unfold. Crowds gathered, some hoping to see blood with their own eyes, others just there so they could brag, "I was there that day," over drinks later. Just like today, when people line up to buy the newest iPhone, many don't really need it, but would regret not being part of the moment. An interesting detail rarely mentioned in books. Anne's execution scaffold was very low, only about 1 meter high, instead of the tall platforms we often see in films. Why? Because Henry didn't want her to have any height advantage in death. A low scaffold meant Anne was close to the ground, close to the crowd, a literal and symbolic lowering of her dignity. Sound familiar? Like in company meetings, where sometimes the boss's chair is just slightly higher, reminding you who's really in charge. Then comes the most controversial detail. Anne's eyes and lips were said to have still moved a few seconds after her head was severed. Some witnesses swore they saw her trying to finish a prayer. Modern scientists explain that the brain still has oxygen for a few seconds, causing muscle reactions. But perhaps fact and legend have blended, making the moment all the more haunting. Imagine watching a play where the curtain drops and then the main character winks at the audience. Creepy, isn't it? And one more thing. Even her burial was an insult. With no proper coffin, the ladies in waiting had to urgently find an arrow chest to place her body in. A Queen of England, in the end, was shoved into a rough wooden box, hastily buried beneath a chapel floor. No tombstone, no marker. As if the entire court wanted to erase her existence as fast as possible. You know, it wasn't until many centuries later that her grave was finally traced. Like when you accidentally delete an important folder, only to realize years later that it was still sitting somewhere on an old hard drive. Another strange detail that is rarely noticed. Henry VIII, the powerful husband, was not present at the execution. While the crowds buzzed at the Tower of London, Henry was at Whitehall Palace, eagerly waiting for the message, "It's done," so he could prepare to marry Jane Seymour. Yes, it's no different from a guy who just hit unfriend on his ex on Facebook and immediately updates his status to "in a relationship with someone new." So cold that you don't know whether to be horrified or impressed by his time-saving efficiency. But the story doesn't end with how Anne died. It's about how her death became a political tool. Henry wanted the people to believe she was truly a traitor, a witch who dared to challenge the patriarchal order. To do that, he didn't just cut off her head, he also cut her reputation to pieces, destroyed her honor, and even declared her daughter Elizabeth illegitimate. Ironically, Elizabeth would later become one of the greatest queens in English history. You see, sometimes history is funnier than a Greek tragedy. Historians still debate. Did Henry truly believe Anne was guilty, or did he simply need an excuse to marry again and produce a son? Some scholars argue that he was manipulated by Cromwell, his cunning right-hand man. Others insist Henry himself was the mastermind. The answer remains unclear, but you and I both understand. When power speaks, the truth often gets twisted into a drama just gripping enough for everyone to remember. And that's what lingers in your mind when you hear this story at night. You hear the wind rustling outside your window. Imagine the church bells ringing on that May morning in 1536 and suddenly realize the terrifying part isn't the blade. It's how a human being was turned into public entertainment. If social media had existed back then, there would have been a live stream with thousands of comments saying, "Just watching." And perhaps you'd have to admit, we don't need demons, humans already know how to create their own horrors. You close your eyes for a moment, letting your imagination take you beyond the instant the blade fell. The head is dropped, the crowd's murmur fades, but its echo still reverberates through the English court. You feel as if a documentary camera is slowly panning across the faces, some pale with fear, others satisfied to have just witnessed the king's justice. And there are those who remain silent, but inside a vague fear rises. If a queen could be discarded so easily, then who is truly safe? The next official event is very clear. Just a few days after Anne Boleyn's death, Henry VIII publicly became engaged, and then married Jane Seymour. The speed was so fast you could imagine it like a guy who just unfriended his ex and immediately hit add friend on the new girl the same day. Even people back then gossiped about it, though they didn't dare speak too loudly. The death of a queen, in the end, was merely a bothersome step on the path to finding someone to bear a son. What few people notice. Anne not only lost her life, but her image was thoroughly erased. Her portraits were taken down, her queenly symbols recarved. The court suddenly acted as though there had never been a queen named Anne. Even in official records, mentioning her became taboo. Imagine it like a character being erased from a TV series, with the writers pretending they never existed. Sadly, history doesn't have a Ctrl+Z button to restore anything. Historians continue to debate. Did Henry truly want to erase every trace of Anne? Or was that simply a natural result of rebuilding royal power? Some believe Henry feared that the memory of Anne might become a symbol of resistance, especially since many had once adored her. Others think more simply. To him, everything other than producing a male heir was meaningless. So erasing Anne was just cleaning up an unnecessary page in the book. And you see, this tragedy did not end with Anne. Her daughter, Elizabeth, only 3 years old, was immediately stripped of her title as princess and deemed illegitimate. It was said that Elizabeth was too young to understand what was happening, but the sudden changes, her clothes, her attendants, the rituals painted her entire childhood in the color of loss. It may sound distant, but try to put yourself in her place. If tomorrow morning you woke up and were told that your home, your family, and even your surname were no longer legal, how would you feel? Another strange detail few people know. Some of the ladies in waiting who had once served Anne, after witnessing her death, could not endure the psychological burden. Some were haunted to the point of having nightmares every night. Some chose to leave the court, and others even entered convents seeking peace. That death, therefore, did not just destroy one person. It sent shockwaves into the hearts of innocent people around her. Like accidentally watching a horror movie at midnight, you're not the main character. But the terror sticks with you for an entire week, making you sleep with the lights on. Modern researchers continue to argue fiercely about the calculated cruelty behind this execution. Some view it as evidence of Tudor psychological warfare, a way in which power doesn't just kill, but obliterates the image to serve as a warning. Others argue we shouldn't modernize the past too much, because in that context, slander, executions, and character assassination were commonplace, not unique to Anne. But this very debate proves something. The case of Anne Boleyn was not just a death, but a case study in how the state can bend the truth to serve power. You sigh, and suddenly realize, what happened to Anne doesn't feel unfamiliar in today's world. When someone becomes too visible, too dangerous to the order, accusations can spring from nowhere, and their image can be torn down overnight. Instead of axes and swords, today we have social media, where someone's honor can be executed with just a few tweets. The difference is, Anne never had a chance to speak back, while we at least can post a status in return. And you chuckle softly. History repeats itself, only the tools change. Perhaps if Anne lived today, she would be a trending headline with the hashtag number Justice for Anne. But then, like every other scandal, people would quickly forget and chase after the next story. You hear the fan humming gently and feel a slight shiver. Not from blood, but from the bone-deep chill of injustice. The death of Anne Boleyn, seen from another angle, was not just the death of a person, it was proof that truth can be transformed into theatre. And when the stage lights go out, only a heavy darkness remains, enough to make you quietly wonder, are we too living inside a scripted play, just not yet aware of it? You take a slow breath, and imagine yourself looking further not just to that May morning of 1536, but to the long aftershocks that rippled through the Tudor dynasty. The death of Anne Boleyn was like a stone thrown into a still lake. The waves spread endlessly, touching every person, every political decision, and even the fate of England itself. The next undeniable historical event, just a few weeks after Anne was executed, Henry VIII and Jane Seymour got married. A marriage so rushed that even the people furrowed their brows. And you, if you had lived in that era, would probably have whispered, "That was fast," while quietly swallowing your fear. Because anyone who dared to speak too loudly might find themselves in the Tower of London the next morning. It's like when you're at work and your boss changes strategy yesterday and launches a new project today. You're surprised, but still have to nod and say, "Yes, it's wonderful," because no one wants to be crossed off the payroll list at the end of the month. What few notice, Anne Boleyn's death cast a heavy atmosphere of unease over the entire Tudor court. The nobles who had once supported her quietly withdrew, and those loyal to Henry became even more submissive. The palace turned into a place where every glance was cautious, every word weighed with care. It was said that just mentioning Anne with a sympathetic tone could bring trouble upon one's entire family. Really, you don't have to imagine too far. Surely you've been in a group chat where just seen at the wrong time was enough to cause drama. Historians still debate, did Henry truly succeed in erasing the memory of Anne? Some scholars say that for many years, she nearly vanished from official records. But others argue that collective memory is not so easily deleted. Rumors, whispered stories, and even secret letters continued to mention Anne, like a small flame quietly smoldering in the dark. History, after all, is like a USB drive. You can delete the file, but if you don't fully format it, the traces remain. You look over at a 3-year-old child, pale red hair, bright eyes. That is Elizabeth, Anne's daughter. Stripped of her princess title, Elizabeth was no longer a legitimate heir. But the very child deemed invalid would later become Elizabeth I, the great queen who ushered in England's golden age. How bitterly ironic that Henry tried to bury the memory of Elizabeth's mother, yet somehow Anne lived again through the brilliance of her daughter. You can see it, the genes in that family were strong indeed, like a band hit song that still makes the charts through a remix. A rarely mentioned detail: when Elizabeth ascended the throne in 1558, she never publicly restored her mother's honour. No monument, no memorial. She remained silent, but that silence was also a strategy. Elizabeth knew that as long as she lived and ruled successfully, the memory of Anne Boleyn would be naturally redeemed. Historians still debate. Was it political caution, or a personal wound too painful to touch? You lean back in your chair and see a sweet paradox. Henry VIII did everything he could to erase Anne, but in the end, he accidentally turned her into an immortal symbol. People remember Anne not only because of her tragic death, but because she was Elizabeth's mother. Just like when you think someone is gone forever, but then you see their reflection in the smile or the voice of their child. History, it turns out, also carries emotional inheritance. There's also another debate. Many modern scholars argue that Anne was not entirely a victim, that she was a savvy political figure who used her intellect and charm to climb to the throne. So then, was she punished for her ambition, or simply for daring to go too far in a man's world? You see, that's not an easy question to answer. It's like today when people talk about a successful female CEO. Some admire her, others say, that kind of success can't be pure. Different opinions, but at heart, they still reflect the same gender bias that has never truly disappeared. A small but memorable detail. When Anne stepped onto the scaffold, she spoke her final words praising the merciful king. Many considered it submission, but some scholars saw another layer of meaning. She acknowledged that the law had condemned her, but never admitted guilt. A clever double-edged statement, like posting a cryptic status on Facebook. How people interpret it is up to them. In truth, it was Anne's final act of resistance, subtle, yet sharp enough to challenge the court's lies. You hear the fan whirring beside your ear and begin to wonder, what is truly the most frightening part of this? Is it the cold swing of the blade? Or is it the way Henry VIII turned a human being into a political tool, a cautionary tale for all other women? For Anne Boleyn, death was only the conclusion. The true spectacle was the destruction of her name. And that spectacle, nearly 500 years later, still leaves a bitter aftertaste even now. You tilt your head gently, letting the story turn back the wheel of time back before Anne Boleyn appeared, before the politically soaked tragedy of 1536. You are returning to the early years of Henry VIII's reign, when the young king had just ascended the throne and chose for himself a first marriage that seemed peaceful but ultimately opened a long, bitter chain of tragedy for all of England. The official historical event. Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess, in the year 1509, just a few weeks after he took the throne. Catherine had been the widow of Arthur Henry's older brother, who had died young from illness. Henry's decision to marry his sister-in-law stirred much gossip, but the Pope granted permission, deeming it a legal union. And so, a marriage that seemed to be a mere political formality became the starting point of one of Europe's greatest religious and marital crises. Imagine it. A 16th century royal wedding trumpets, blaring red silk spread across Westminster Abbey, and the young couple walking in as if they were the lead characters in a long-running historical drama. Henry was just 17 then, tall with shining red hair, and a strong figure like a knight stepping out of a painting. Catherine, 6 years older than Henry, had already experienced widowhood, but retained her gentle beauty, carrying the noble aura of Spanish royalty with deep eyes and a proud presence. The people rejoiced. They saw before them an ideal couple, the embodiment of the England-Spain alliance. A strange detail rarely mentioned. Catherine had lived for many years in hardship in England before marrying Henry. After Arthur's death, she was kept in England, not allowed to return home, living in a near-limbo state at the Tudor court. Her allowance was cut off, and she even had to sell dishes and jewellery just to survive. At times, Catherine and her ladies-in-waiting had to cook for themselves a shocking image for a royal princess. And yet, from that precarious place, she ascended to queenship, as if fate was playing a cruel trick in preparation for a long and tragic saga. Historians still debate the true nature of the relationship between Henry and Catherine. Some claim that in the early years, they truly loved each other. Henry appeared to be a devoted husband, often writing romantic poetry to his wife. Catherine was also wholehearted in her role as queen, joining Henry in receiving diplomatic delegations and appearing with him at public ceremonies. But other scholars believe that love was quickly overshadowed by the pressure to bear a son. Although Catherine became pregnant many times, most of her children died in infancy. Only one child survived Mary, the princess born in 1516. You can imagine the disappointment within the palace. Henry needed a male heir to secure the throne, but every hope kept vanishing. Each time Catherine miscarried or lost a child, the atmosphere in the palace sank into gloom. People prayed, but faith gradually turned into rumor that God does not bless this marriage. And that very rumor, years later, was the reason Henry used to seek a divorce. You see, when a relationship begins to fall apart, there are 1,000 excuses to lay blame, and in the Tudor era, God's will was excuse number one. The interesting thing is that Catherine didn't just sit quietly in the shadows. She once took on the role of regent when Henry was away at war. In 1513, while Henry was campaigning in France, Catherine stayed behind to govern the country and even sent him a suit of armour to boost morale. When the Scots invaded from the north, she personally oversaw the defence preparations. After the Battle of Flodden, the body of King James IV of Scotland was sent to London, and Catherine even intended to send Henry a blood-stained piece of the king's cloak as a trophy. You see, a Spanish princess who once lived in hardship now appeared as a warrior. Yet, historians also argue fiercely, was Catherine truly happy in her marriage? Some records describe her as gentle, patient, living for her faith and duty, but other sources reveal a growing dissatisfaction within her as Henry began to stray. From a young age, Henry was known for his amorous nature. Even after marrying Catherine, he remained fond of parties, hunting, and openly flirting with noblewomen at court. If you've ever heard the phrase, a womanizer by blood, Henry VIII was the living example. You take a breath and imagine the paradox. Catherine, a devout woman who tied her life to Henry through every sacrifice, was ultimately cast aside by that very husband for another woman, Anne Boleyn. And to cast her aside, Henry didn't just break up with her. He launched an entire religious revolution, breaking away from the Roman Church. That's the power of a Tudor love triangle. It didn't just make a few people cry, it shook all of Europe. You see, Henry VIII's first marriage wasn't merely a royal romance. It was the beginning of all the tragedy and chaos that followed. Had Catherine given birth to a healthy prince, perhaps there would have been no Anne Boleyn, no religious reformation, and England might have taken a different path. But history never deals in what-ifs. You close your eyes, hear the wind swirling in your imagination, and let yourself drift along the current of history. This time, you are no longer in the brief happy years at the beginning of Henry's reign. We have stepped into the years 1520 to 1530, when the marriage with Catherine of Aragon had lasted more than 2 decades but had failed to give Henry what he desired most, a prince. And from a place of love, he began to see his first wife as an obstacle on the path to finding a male heir. The official historical event, this was the King's Great Matter. Henry sought every possible way to divorce Catherine in order to marry Anne Boleyn, one of the Queen's youngest and most intelligent ladies in waiting. Anne was unlike other mistresses. She refused to be the other woman in the shadows. She was proud and direct, either queen or nothing at all, and it was that very challenge that made Henry all the more captivated. If Catherine represented the steadfastness of tradition, Anne was the fresh breeze, mysterious, alluring. Like a newly launched social media app, people were curious, drawn in, and ready to abandon the old for something new. A strange fact few know. Henry once cited the Bible to justify his divorce. He quoted from the book of Leviticus that, "A man shall not marry his brother's wife. If he does, he will have no sons." Henry argued that his marriage to Catherine was a sin because she had been Arthur's wife. Yet ironically, it was the Pope who had once granted permission for this very marriage. Now Henry wanted to reverse it, claiming it had all been a theological mistake. Think about it, it's like signing up for a Netflix family plan, using it for over 10 years, and then suddenly demanding a refund because I was never supposed to be allowed to subscribe in the first place. Historians still debate. Did Henry truly believe his marriage was religiously invalid, or was this simply a legal excuse to marry Anne? Some scholars say Henry sincerely believed that God was punishing him by withholding a son. Others clearly see it as a political tactic. But one thing is certain, whether the belief was genuine or not, it led to a seismic event: England's break from the Roman Church. Imagine Catherine at that time. She was over 40, her body weakened after many failed pregnancies, but her pride remained unshaken. Catherine firmly refused to be cast aside. She declared that the marriage was valid and that she was Henry's one true queen. During the hearings, she knelt before her husband, pleading with him to remember their years together, to remember her loyalty. But Henry, instead of softening, saw this as the moment to seal his resolve. You listen to this part of the story and sigh. Sometimes, a love that lasts 2 decades can be erased by a single glance at someone new. Another strange twist. This divorce crisis was not merely about love and marriage, it was directly tied to international politics. Catherine was the aunt of Emperor Charles V, the most powerful man in Europe at the time. Charles placed immense pressure on the Pope not to grant Henry a divorce. As a result, what was supposedly a marriage issue for one English king turned into a showdown between Europe's great powers. Like a celebrity divorce today, suddenly becoming a global legal battle, live-streamed for the whole world. As the Pope continued to delay, Henry made an unprecedented move. He separated England from the Roman Church and declared himself the head of the Church of England. This marked the English Reformation, and it all began not from lofty theological ideals, but from a king who wanted to divorce in order to marry his mistress. You chuckle quietly. Truly, history sometimes feels no different from a sitcom, except the consequences are deadly serious. Historians still argue to this day. If not for Anne Boleyn, would Henry have dared to break away from Rome? Some believe Anne was merely the last straw, as Henry had long desired to assert supreme authority. But others believe that it was love or obsession for Anne that was the true driving force. And you realize, sometimes a personal love affair is enough to turn the wheel of an entire nation's history. You lean back in your chair, hearing the fans whirring like the heartbeat of time, and shudder. A family matter had turned into a national crisis. Catherine was deposed, Anne Boleyn became queen, the Church of England was born, and all of Europe was shaken. It all began with a man who could not accept the fact that he only had a daughter. You let your mind drift along the river of history once more, this time pausing at the moment when Anne Boleyn officially stepped out of the shadows to become queen. After years of struggle, the king's great matter was finally resolved by Henry VIII in a way no one expected. He publicly severed ties with the Pope, married Anne, and placed the crown upon her head in a dazzling ceremony. Those were the short-lived, glorious years, when Anne seemed to have touched the pinnacle of power. But it was also the moment when fate began to write its tragic script. The official event, on the 1st of June, 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned at Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was more lavish than ever before, so costly that the treasury strained under its weight. Crowds flooded the streets of London, from nobles to commoners, all eager to see the woman who had caused the entire nation to change its faith. Anne wore a splendid queen's robe, a heavy crown upon her head, walking on a crimson carpet that seemed to stretch endlessly. It was said that Henry had arranged this grand spectacle to declare to all of Europe, "This is my rightful queen, none can deny it." And, a strange detail rarely mentioned, Anne Boleyn, despite becoming queen, remained a deeply polarizing figure. Many common people were curious, even admired her beauty and intelligence. But those loyal to Catherine saw Anne as a witch, a seductress who had shattered Henry's sacred marriage. In London's taverns, people secretly passed around mocking verses, giving Anne cruel nicknames. If social media had existed then, Anne would certainly have been dragged, just like today's scandalous celebrities. Historians still debate, was Anne truly supported by the public on her coronation day, or was it merely a staged display? Some accounts describe the crowd cheering enthusiastically, but other records say many simply stood and watched coldly, some even turned their backs. Perhaps like all public events, the truth lies somewhere in between. Some were thrilled, some outraged, and most were just there to see what was going on. Imagine yourself jostling in that crowd back then. The mingled scent of sweat and ale in the sweltering early summer air, the echo of trumpets and drums, and in the distance, Anne walking regally. The light glinting off the crown made her eyes shine, proud yet weary. You inhale, and realize the scent of power always carries with it the smell of suspicion. Anne quickly established her position in the court. She was intelligent, lively, and skilled in conversation and debate with scholars. Unlike the gentle Catherine, Anne had a strong and straightforward personality. Henry was enamored with that intellect, but it was also this directness that quietly accumulated enemies. Much like in the workplace, the outspoken ones often get noticed but also disliked behind their backs. A little-known fact: during her early years as queen, Anne Boleyn actively supported the arts, literature, and religious reform. She encouraged the Bible to be translated into English, helping the people access the Word of God directly instead of through the clergy. It was a bold move, making many see her as a heroine of the Reformation. But at the same time, this also turned Anne into a thorn in the side of the conservative Catholic faction. Historians continue to debate: was Anne truly devout and driven by faith to promote reform, or did she simply use religion as a tool to consolidate power? The question remains unanswered. But clearly, Anne's image was never just that of a beautiful woman who captivated a king. She was also a truly influential political figure. Then, in September of 1533, Anne gave birth to a child, Elizabeth. Henry had longed for a prince, but the result was a princess. At first, Henry still appeared pleased, believing that future pregnancies would bring a son. But the seed of disappointment had already begun to take root. You see, even as queen, Anne could not escape the pressure, bear a son or not. Indeed, in Tudor times, the worth of a woman, even a queen, was reduced to bearing children. If there had been a group chat for moms back then, Anne would have been the most pressured member. You sit in silence for a moment, then smile bitterly. Anne Boleyn had reached the pinnacle of power, but at the top, the wind is cold. Beneath her, countless eyes of envy, resentment, and ambition waited for the chance to bring her down, and tragedy, as you know, was only a matter of time. The official historical event: after giving birth to Princess Elizabeth in 1533, Anne Boleyn continued to become pregnant several times. But each ended in tragedy: miscarriages or infants who died shortly after birth. The breaking point came in 1536, when she miscarried a fetus believed to be male. Henry, already losing patience, took it as a sign that God did not bless this marriage. From that moment, Anne's place in the king's heart began to falter. Imagine yourself in Anne's position, sitting in the cold room of Greenwich Palace, hearing the rain tapping against the window, her body aching from the loss, and her heart full of uncertainty. She once believed power would protect her, only to realize the throne was nothing more than a shaky wooden chair, always at risk of being pulled from beneath her. Just like when you get promoted, thinking you're safe, only to find all eyes are watching, waiting for you to fall. A strange detail few mention: Henry VIII once suffered a serious injury in a jousting accident in 1536, a fall that left him unconscious for hours. Many historians believe this fall dramatically changed Henry's temperament. He became irritable, cruel, and prone to outbursts. Coincidentally, just days after the accident, Anne miscarried. Whispers spread. Perhaps this is a sign from God to end her bloodline. You see, in those times, every personal misfortune could be twisted into a divine proof. If Twitter had existed then, the hashtag number God's will would have trended within hours. Historians still debate: did Henry truly stop loving Anne, or was it merely the pressure to have a son that made him change direction? Some argue he had grown to despise Anne's strong-willed and argumentative nature. She was nothing like the gentle Catherine, and even dared to interrupt the king during court sessions. Others insist the main reason was still his obsession with having a male heir. Whatever the cause, once affection faded, Anne became nothing more than a target for political factions to bring down. Imagine the royal banquets of that time: flickering candlelight, red wine swirling in golden goblets, yet the atmosphere tense like a stretched string. Anne sat high above, draped in her queenly cloak, but every word she spoke was scrutinized. A forced smile could be twisted into mocking the courtiers, a frown interpreted as disrespecting the king. Power, in the end, was just a fragile mask. A little-known fact: Anne once had great influence over foreign policy and internal court affairs. She took part in discussions, supported figures who opposed the old Catholic powers, and even had a voice in appointing officials. To many Tudor men, this was hard to accept. Some saw Anne as a manipulator of the king, a 16th century Yoko Ono, blamed for pulling Henry away from the Roman Church. And as Henry began to distance himself, her silent enemies immediately seized the chance, spreading rumors of the Queen's debauchery. Historians debate, were the charges of adultery and incest against Anne entirely fabricated, or was there a sliver of truth? Most agree the evidence was absurdly thin, yet some scholars suggest Anne may have flirted too boldly in conversation, giving enemies the opportunity to exaggerate. Either way, what is certain is that these accusations became the primary weapon for Henry and Thomas Cromwell to bring her down. You lean back in your chair, the sound of the fan like a distant breath, and feel a chill. Anne Boleyn, the woman who once inspired Henry to defy the Pope, was now nothing more than a pawn about to be removed. From power to disgrace, the distance, really, was just one miscarriage. You let out a bitter chuckle. In every era, a woman might rise to the top through charm and intellect, only to lose everything simply because her body didn't produce what society demanded. And that is the greatest cruelty of Tudor history. You take a deep breath, letting your mind return to the suffocating atmosphere of the palace in early 1536, when dark clouds had begun to gather over the Tudor court. If in the early years of her queenship, Anne Boleyn had been cherished by Henry as the heart of England, now she was merely a thorn in the side of both the king and the political faction waiting for their moment. The official historical event. In early May of 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested and taken to the Tower of London under a long list of charges: adultery with multiple men, incest with her own brother George Boleyn, and even conspiracy to poison and kill the king. The list of accusations was so lengthy it sounded like a soap opera script, yet the evidence was as thin as paper. Imagine that scene. A sweltering morning, royal guards burst into the palace, faces cold, eyes sharp. Anne was forced to leave her chambers, leaving behind her crown, leaving behind every symbol of power she had fought for 3 years to earn. Walking across the palace courtyard, she saw the maids who once knelt before her now only dared to glance from afar, then turned away. The cold didn't come from the stone walls, but from the silence of people. Like in an office, yesterday you were the director, but after the termination email is sent, suddenly all your colleagues pretend to be too busy to see you. A little-known fact: Anne was not put on trial immediately. She was imprisoned for many days in the Tower of London, and the very place that once prepared her for the coronation in 1533 now became her prison while awaiting death. It's said that Anne remained strangely calm. Sometimes she laughed and chatted with her maids. Other times she whispered prayers for hours. One witness recorded that Anne even made a sarcastic remark: "How absurd that a weak woman like me could be said to have conquered so many men." You might laugh, but then suddenly feel a chill, because that laugh was no different from a final shield hiding despair. Historians continue to debate, did Henry VIII truly believe the accusations? Or was it all a performance orchestrated by Thomas Cromwell, his powerful right hand, to eliminate Anne? Some scholars believe Henry genuinely felt betrayed and humiliated, especially after repeated miscarriages. But most agree that this was a carefully crafted political plot. Cromwell needed a scapegoat to secure his position, and Henry wanted to be free to marry Jane Seymour. That combination made Anne the perfect victim. You step into your imagination on the day of the trial. The Council of Nobles, many of whom once owed Anne favours, now turned their backs and voted guilty. No one dared to speak in her defence. In that suffocating room, Anne stood tall, her eyes bright, her voice steady as she declared her innocence. But you already know in that place, truth held no value. The verdict had been written before the trial even began. Like a competition where the judges had already chosen the winner, everything else was just ceremony. Another strange detail: Anne's brother, George Boleyn, was also tried and convicted of incest with his sister. The evidence? Nothing more than baseless rumours and vague records. Yet George was still executed several days before his sister. The image of two siblings, one a queen, one a young noble, falling together into a pit of injustice leaves later generations trembling. If you've ever seen a mafia movie where the whole team gets wiped out, this was the Tudor version. Historians also debate Anne's true emotional state during her final days in the Tower of London. Some records claim she descended into panic, laughing and crying erratically. Other accounts insist she remained composed, even comforting her maids. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, a woman both strong and afraid, both proud and hopeless. Because who wouldn't tremble, knowing the exact date and time of their own death? You see, Anne Boleyn, from a powerful queen to a prisoner bearing the most disgraceful accusations, lost everything in just a few short months. And this tragedy, though nearly 5 centuries have passed, still sends a chill down our spines, because it reveals a raw truth. In a world where power is the only law, a human life can be broken by nothing more than a flimsy sheet of accusation. You sigh, then wonder, could it be that in our modern lives we are still witnessing new Tudor trials, where the strong write the laws and the weak become the punchline of public spectacle? After all, history is never that far from the present. You shift slightly in your chair, letting the story leap across a gap of over 2 decades. From the cold blade that fell upon Anne Boleyn's neck in 1536, we arrive at the year 1558, when the little girl once called Bastard, once stripped of her princess title, was now about to wear the crown and become Queen Elizabeth I. And you realize the mother's tragedy had unknowingly paved the path for the daughter's immortality. The official historical event: Elizabeth ascended the throne on the 17th of November, 1558, after the death of her half-sister Mary I. At the time, Elizabeth was just 25 years old, and all of England was shaken. Crowds cheered upon hearing the news, for after years of division caused by religious turmoil and Mary's failed marriages, they hoped Elizabeth would bring stability. And how ironic, the throne that Henry VIII once reserved for a son now belonged to the very daughter he had once declared illegitimate. Imagine that moment. A foggy morning at Hatfield House, Elizabeth wrapped in a fur-lined cloak, stepping out before courtiers kneeling for news. A courtier bows low and announces that Mary has died, and Elizabeth is now queen. In that instant, the girl once pushed to the margins of power became the very centre of the Tudor world. You can almost hear history itself, letting out a gentle sigh. Justice may come late, but it comes. A little-known detail: Elizabeth did not rush to London to flaunt her crown. She waited, prayed, and even read a line from Scripture. "This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes." A small detail, but it showed how deeply Elizabeth understood symbolism she was. Not just a new monarch, but a living restoration of her mother's honour. And Anne Boleyn, who had been beheaded, erased, now indirectly lived again in her daughter's glory. Historians continue to debate. Did Elizabeth deliberately seek to restore her mother's image? Or did she avoid mentioning Anne to stay politically safe? Some scholars say Elizabeth was cautious, rarely speaking of Anne Boleyn publicly, since the name still carried accusations of treason and incest. But others insist she honoured her mother quietly by keeping private mementos, promoting Boleyn relatives, and most importantly, never allowing anyone to question her own dignity as Anne's daughter. Whether publicly or privately, Elizabeth's very presence on the throne was enough to undo Henry's every attempt to erase Anne. You lean back, picturing the coronation in 1559. London's streets lined with flowers, flags fluttering, crowds packed and cheering. Elizabeth riding a white horse, a heavy crown on her head, sceptre in hand. She smiles, calm and poised, but her eyes shine with a message. "Mother, they tried to erase us, but I have returned." And you, in that imagined moment, feel a shiver like you've just witnessed a message whispered across time. A detail rarely mentioned. Elizabeth never married, never bore children, and for 45 years of rule, she turned herself into the Virgin Queen, a figure both mysterious and iconic. Many historians believe that the bitter memory of her mother, a woman who lost everything for love and marriage, was what led Elizabeth to choose the path of solitude. She made herself the only wife of England. A subtle rebellion, but one of great strength. Historians still argue, did Elizabeth remain single out of love for power, or because of the haunting past? Some say she was wise by not marrying. She spared the country from being manipulated by a foreign husband. But others believe that deep within Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's shadow still loomed too large. The fear of betrayal, of abandonment, had sealed her heart forever. You sit quietly for a while, then realize the story of Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I is like two sides of a coin. The mother lost everything and was buried in disgrace. The daughter rose, turned tragedy into strength, and led England into its golden age. If this were a movie, you might say the script was too dramatic. But the truth of history is sometimes more theatrical than fiction. You chuckle softly. Henry VIII, the king who longed for a son, ended up leaving his most brilliant legacy to a daughter. And Elizabeth I, every time she stood before her court, every time she signed a decree, unintentionally proved that Anne Boleyn had never truly been erased. You lean back, letting the story continue, and this time you are in the year 1559, just 1 year after Elizabeth officially wore the crown. The air in London is festive, but beneath the cheers lie silent tensions. A young, unmarried queen ascending the throne of a nation still torn apart by religious crisis. And you see clearly. Elizabeth stepped onto the political stage with bright eyes, but her shoulders carried an entire kingdom teetering on the edge. The official historical event. In the early years of Elizabeth I's reign, England was mired in conflict between Catholics and Protestants. Her sister Mary I, Bloody Mary, had tried to restore Catholicism through violence, leaving hundreds executed at the stake. When Elizabeth took the throne, she had to choose: continue the path of blood or find another way. She chose compromise. In 1559, she passed the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Uniformity, affirming the monarchy as head of the Church of England, but also leaving room for certain Catholic rights. That decision paved a middle path enough to reassure the Protestants, but not enough to push Catholics into despair. Imagine it. A 25-year-old woman sitting in council among bearded men, their eyes judgmental, their voices laced with resistance. And yet Elizabeth sat upright, smiled, and spoke in a gentle but firm voice. Perhaps you'd be surprised. She didn't shout, didn't slam the table, but her words fell like stone. That was Elizabeth's way of ruling authority without display, like a meeting leader who only needs to purse her lips for the room to fall silent. A little-known detail. Elizabeth was remarkably skilled at crafting her image. She appeared in public in extravagant gowns, with pale painted skin and blazing red hair, creating an impression both distant and enchanting. But in private audiences, she dressed simply and spoke intimately, making each visitor feel special. That was the art of balancing divinity and humanity. Today, you'd call it personal branding, and Elizabeth was Europe's earliest marketing expert. Historians still debate, was Elizabeth truly devout, or did she use religion as a political tool? Some insist she believed in the middle way as an ideal. Others argue she saw it as a clever means to secure her throne. Either way, the truth is that England avoided a bloody religious civil war because of it. And sometimes, whether it's idealism or calculation, hardly matters as long as it saves thousands of lives. Imagine one of Elizabeth's processions through the streets of London. People crowd and cheer. Children perch on their fathers' shoulders waving paper flags. She rides a white horse, a red cloak draped around her, hand raised in a gentle wave, her smile serene. In a city once trembling from the fires of religious persecution, that image felt like a promise. There will be no more flames for the innocent. You feel your heart beating faster, as if you too were standing in that crowd of long ago. Few people mention this. In the early years of her reign, Elizabeth constantly faced assassination plots and rebellions. The Catholic faction loyal to the Pope viewed her as a false queen, while conservatives considered a single woman on the throne to be against nature. But Elizabeth never flinched. She nurtured a network of spies organized by Francis Walsingham, a kind of Tudor-era MI6. Thanks to that, all coup attempts were crushed before they could even begin. You see, Elizabeth was not only a queen, but also a national security boss. If Netflix made a series, you'd binge it all night. Historians still debate, was Elizabeth's decision not to marry a strategy or a fear? Some scholars argue she was too clever. Marrying any foreign prince would turn England into the backyard of another country. But others believe that the memory of her mother, Anne Boleyn, who lost her life because of a marriage, made Elizabeth reject the idea altogether. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Elizabeth was both politically shrewd and personally wounded. You lean back, listening to the steady hum of a fan, and feel a slight shiver. Elizabeth I rose to the throne not only to rule but to rewrite the memory of her mother. Without building statues or making declarations, She proved through her 45-year reign that Anne Boleyn was never erased, but lived on in the glory of her daughter. You relax your shoulders and let your imagination drift into the most radiant period of Elizabeth I's reign, when England, once a small nation torn by religious strife and political instability, gradually rose to become a European power. People call it the Elizabethan Golden Age. And you'll see, that brilliant light did not come naturally. It was earned through intelligence, courage, and the daring choices of a queen once dismissed as an illegitimate daughter. Official historical event. In the year 1588, Queen Elizabeth I led England through one of its greatest political storms, the attack of the Spanish Armada, one of the most powerful fleets in Europe. King Philip II of Spain, who had once been the husband of Mary I, viewed Elizabeth as a heretic queen who had to be destroyed. He launched over 130 massive warships carrying 30,000 soldiers, intending to flatten England. But then, thanks to a combination of clever naval tactics, agile and flexible English ships, and an unexpected storm, the Armada was shattered. The English called it the Wind of God, a divine gift that protected the kingdom. Imagine it, a grey sky, the sea roaring, enormous Spanish ships falling to violent waves, while English sailors cheered. On shore, Elizabeth rode a white horse, dressed in silver armour, appearing at Tilbury to rally her troops. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." That sentence rang out, transforming doubt into strength. You get goosebumps. This queen dared to stand among thousands of soldiers and assert herself with fierce pride. It was truly a masterclass in brand communication. Little known fact, after the victory, Elizabeth didn't rush to celebrate. She knew the Spanish fleet could return at any time and that England was still poor compared to the continent. Instead of lavish parties, she quietly focused on rebuilding the navy. That very caution laid the foundation for England's future dominance of the seas. You see, while many people win battles and immediately party all night, Elizabeth chose to clean up the battlefield. Historians still debate, was the victory over the Armada due to brilliant strategy, or simply luck from a sea storm? Some insist that without the Wind of God, the English could hardly have resisted such a vastly superior force. But others emphasize that it was precisely because the English navy was small and agile and employed the tactic of fire ships, releasing burning vessels into the enemy fleet, that the Armada was shattered. Perhaps the truth lies in both. Human intelligence combined with a bit of luck. You lean your head back, letting your eyes follow Elizabeth's next steps. After overcoming the threat from Spain, she focused on building the image of the Virgin Queen. Unmarried, childless, she turned her body into a symbol of the nation. The people believed she was the wife of England. Portraits depicted her with a porcelain, white face, gowns encrusted with jewels, surrounded by the sun, moon, stars, and divine symbols. Like a Tudor-era Marvel poster, Elizabeth was the superhero, carrying the entire country on her shoulders. A little-known fact, Elizabeth paid great attention to camera angles. She banned painters from producing portraits without her approval, ensuring her image was always beautiful and immortal. Even paintings done when she was old were retouched to look youthful and radiant. This wasn't so different from using Instagram filters today, except Elizabeth's filter was the royal painter. Historians still debate, was Elizabeth truly a virgin queen in the literal sense, or was it just a marketing campaign to retain power? Some scholars believe she never married, never had relations. But others think Elizabeth had secret affairs, especially with Robert Dudley, the closest companion of her life. What the truth is, perhaps only she knew. But one thing is certain, the image of the Virgin Queen became a powerful political tool, turning Elizabeth into a living legend. You take a slow breath and reflect on those years. This was also the era of Shakespeare, of Christopher Marlowe, of timeless plays echoing within the Globe Theatre. Literature, art, music, all flourished under Elizabeth's reign, as if she ruled not only through politics, but through inspiration. The people believed they were living in a golden age, and at the center of that radiant light was the young queen with a proud gaze. Official historical event. Elizabeth reigned for nearly half a century, and by the early 1600s, She was over 60 years old, a rare age for a Tudor woman. But the longer she lived, the more she had to face loneliness. Her closest companion, and perhaps her only true love, Robert Dudley, died in 1588, the same year as the Armada victory. His death left a deep void in Elizabeth's heart, to the point that she kept his final letter in a private box and called it, "My sweet Robin's letter." Imagine this: a queen who once donned silver armor and rode on horseback to rally her troops, now sits alone in her palace, gazing at a faded letter, eyes glistening with tears. She allowed no one to touch that letter, as if it were the only thread connecting her to her youthful days. If social media existed today, Elizabeth would probably secretly save their last chat in a favorites folder, never to delete. A strange detail few know: in old age, Elizabeth refused to look in mirrors. She didn't want to see her aged image, didn't want to face the wrinkles or the thinning hair. Her servants had to discreetly keep mirrors out of her sight. Instead, Elizabeth maintained a thick layer of white powder on her face, a lead-based cosmetic that damaged her skin over time, but preserved the image of the immortal queen in the eyes of her court. That was the Tudor filter. Only the more you used it, the more harm it caused. She showed her subjects a powerful symbol, undefeated by age. Regardless, the truth is that every time she appeared in public, with a ghostly white face, dazzling wigs and piercing eyes, the crowd still cheered as if she had never grown old. Imagine a final banquet of the reign. Candlelight casting long shadows, a musician plucking a lute, but Elizabeth no longer danced as she once did. She sat on the throne, quietly observing the young nobles, the descendants of those who had once knelt before her. In her gaze was a faraway look, as if she saw the past mingling among the guests. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, with a proud smile, Robert Dudley with his gallant riding posture, loyal advisors now turned to dust. You hear the distant music and suddenly feel a chill. The feast is crowded. Yet she is the only one truly alone. Few mention this. Elizabeth died without children, with no direct heir. She left the throne to the House of Stuart, specifically to James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary Stuart, the lifelong rival who haunted her. Elizabeth's life was a strange circle. She imprisoned and executed Mary, only to eventually hand the kingdom to Mary's son. A cruel twist of history, as if fate wanted to whisper, "No one wins forever." Ulsex, historians still debate. In her final years, was Elizabeth truly satisfied with her legacy? Some say she was proud. She had protected England, ushered in a golden era. But others emphasize, she died in sorrow, knowing that without children, without a blood heir, the image of the Tudor dynasty would die with her. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, both proud and regretful. Picture her final moment. In the year 1603, Elizabeth lay in bed at Richmond Palace. She refused to lie down for too long, trying to sit upright, afraid that once she collapsed, everyone would know death was near. Her servants had to arrange cushions around the chair so she could lean back, her face pale as snow, her gaze distant. She no longer spoke much, only stared at the ceiling in silence, as if conversing with spirits of the past. And in that silence, perhaps she saw the figure of Anne Boleyn smiling in welcome. You lean your head back and shiver. A dynasty that began in a mother's blood ended in a daughter's solitude. But between those two tragic points, Elizabeth I had written a radiant chapter where Shakespeare breathed life into literature. The English navy ruled the seas, and the image of the Virgin Queen became legend. Perhaps it was solitude that made her great, for in the darkness of her final days, Elizabeth's light burned brighter than ever. You close your eyes, letting all the fragments of the story come together into a complete picture. At one end is Anne Boleyn, a woman who stepped into the Tudor court with intelligent eyes and a proud smile, only to end on the scaffold, erased from records, hurriedly buried in a crude box. At the other end is Elizabeth I, the daughter once labelled illegitimate, now sitting on the throne for nearly half a century, guiding England into a golden age. You realize, history always has its ironic ways of balancing things. Henry VIII wanted a son, but fate gave him a great queen. He tried to erase Anne Boleyn, but Elizabeth's brilliance made Anne immortal. That is the paradox of power. The more one tries to destroy a memory, the stronger it returns. Like a seed buried deep in the soil, seemingly rotting, yet eventually growing into a mighty tree. Few know this. Centuries later, when archaeologists excavated the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula in the Tower of London, they found the remains of Anne Boleyn, identified through modern methods. At last, the woman once hastily buried and forgotten was given a proper tombstone. History, though late, still whispered an apology. Historians still debate. Did Elizabeth deliberately restore her mother's honour, or did she merely focus on ruling, allowing Anne's memory to naturally revive? But whatever the answer, one truth remains. When we speak of Elizabeth I, we cannot help but remember Anne Boleyn. And when we remember Anne Boleyn, we are reminded that she was the mother of one of the greatest queens in history. You sit in silence, hearing the soft hum of the fan like the whisper of time. The story of Anne and Elizabeth is not merely a Tudor family tragedy. It is a reminder of human fate under the weight of power. Power can behead a person, slander their name, but it cannot completely extinguish the memory and influence they leave behind. It is that memory, through Elizabeth, that transformed Anne from criminal to symbol. You smile softly, a mix of irony and sorrow. It took nearly half a century and the death of a forsaken child for people to understand that sometimes the mistakes of the past are the very miracles of the future. Henry VIII left no lasting legacy. His sons died young or ruled briefly. Meanwhile, Elizabeth, the unwanted daughter, left the brightest mark on all of England. And that is the lesson you carry with you as you close this story. True power does not lie on the throne, nor in the hands of those who wield the sword, but in the memory and spirit that are passed down. Anne Boleyn lost her head, but not her voice. Elizabeth I lived in solitude, yet her light still illuminates a century. You exhale gently, smile, and let the echoes of the story fade like the final notes of a symphony. History has closed, but its resonance lingers, so that whenever we remember the Tudors, we will recall the mother who died in shame, and the daughter who lived in glory, two fates intertwined, forming an immortal epic. Dear friend, tonight, the story has come to a close, yet its echoes still float gently like the wind outside your window. You have walked with me through the cold halls of the Tower of London, heard the echoing footsteps, then wandered into the dazzling halls of the Tudor palaces, where power and loneliness always walked hand in hand. And now, everything has settled, like a candle burned to its end, leaving only a soft glow flickering in the dark. Let those images drift away slowly, like closing an old book and placing it back on the shelf. All the tension, all the crowded thoughts of today, you may let them fall asleep with history. They will no longer cling to you. Take a deep breath, then exhale slowly. Feel your heartbeat slow down, like the distant drumbeat of a coronation ceremony from centuries past. And in this stillness, you no longer have to worry about anything. Just let your mind drift, like a small boat anchored on a peaceful lake. If your eyes have closed, let the darkness embrace you gently. This darkness is not frightening. It is like a soft blanket wrapping you in peace. Every exhale is a step further from the present, moving into the realm of dreams, where there is no judgment, no pressure, only the freedom of the soul. And as you sleep, believe that, just as Elizabeth once stood firm in the storm, you too can walk through your own trials. But that is for tomorrow. For now, the only thing you need to do is sleep well. Wishing you a beautiful, gentle dream, and when dawn arrives, may you wake up with a soft smile. Good night.